On today's World Insight, the WTO is set to welcome its first African and female Director General. Can she mediate trade disputes while reforming the organization? And vaccine nationalism emerges at the same time as COVID variants. As border controls rise, can vaccine cooperation remain a global affair? A word with the chairman and CEO of farm giant Merck.
Our assumption is that world leaders will take a rational approach to this and that we can work well with our Chinese and our American friends.
Here is our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. A former Nigerian finance minister, Okonjo-Iweala, will become the first African and first woman to head the World Trade Organization. This comes after a South Korean rival withdrew from the race and the U.S. reversed its earlier opposition. The Biden administration has expressed strong support for the Nigerian, citing her experience at the World Bank and leading Nigeria's finance ministry. The developments ended months of uncertainty over the leadership of the global trade body. Okonjo-Iweala said she was looking to move forward with needed reforms. How does Okonjo-Iweala's appointment affect the influence of different nations? Let's loop in our panelists from the U.S., the European Union, and certainly from China. For more about the WTO's future and its new leader in Beijing, Jörg Wuttke, president of the European Union Chamber of Commerce in China, welcome. In Beijing also, Liu Baocheng, Dean of the Center for International Business Ethics from University of International Business and Economics. In Hong Kong, Xiao Geng, professor at Peking University HSBC Business School. Last but not least, in New York City, Robert Hormats, vice chairman of the Kissinger Associate. He's also former Undersecretary of State for Economic Business and Agricultural Affairs. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. Are we seeing hope about the next stage of a now pretty much collapsed process at the World Trade Organization? Mr. Hormats, your take briefly.
Definitely. I think Ngozi, who I know very well from various relationships in the past, will be a very good leader. And I think also it's important to have a new agenda. The last agenda was really in part designed to accommodate President Trump. Now I think the United States and other countries in the WTO, certainly including China, but many others as well, need to sit down and develop an agenda that makes the WTO more effective, more credible, improves the efficiency of the decision-making, the dispute settlement process. So I think we're off to a new start under a new and excellent leader.
This is a complicated situation, isn't it, Mr. Wuttke? From the Europeans' perspective, how do you see the next stage? Are we really going to the next stage?
Well, I guess so. I mean, the European Union has been supporting her from the moment where she was willing to come up with a candidacy. And for us, of course, it makes a big difference to have at least the hope that a body that made sense in the past is going to be rejuvenated. I mean, I guess she can also lead the discussion of how to reform it, because WTO, as it used to function, I guess, cannot go on anymore. Now, for Europe, it is also a good sign that after Biden signed up the Paris climate agreement, and now WTO, basically also the Americans indicating that they are back on WHO. It's sort of, as Biden put it, the US is back, and of course we welcome this after these 4 horrid years.
The allies might be welcoming the US is back. China also expressed the same. Professor Xiao Geng, tell me more about, does China believe WTO is really embarking onto the next stage?
Well, I think China is expecting that WTO to play an important role in the future. But the crucial is really the U.S. And I think now we see the signal that the U.S. also want to create a good global environment for trade, because U.S. domestically need the global resources to really overcome the difficulties it is facing now. So I think although it's very complicated, but China will most likely support and continue to push for reforms in the WTO. And this is also very, very important for developing countries.
Professor Liu Baocheng, there are a lot of issues that the WTO need to work on. It's already lagged behind, starting from the appellate body, without judges, without panels, then without teeth. Will that be the priority, do you think?
I think, yes, that's one of the 4 priorities the Chinese ambassador to WTO has proposed. First of all, it has to be well-staffed and well-resourced. As for the reform, everyone is talking about reform, but I think every member has their own agenda. Whether the reform will serve their interest or whether that's going to detriment to their interest, that's another very difficult issue. But as long as those issues are identified and the positions filled, resources are provided, this is really already a milestone forward.
Well, things are getting a little bit complicated. We certainly hear different opinions, even though for the same direction of reform. So let's, gentlemen, work on the details. What do you think if you were sitting right across the table from Ms. Okonjo-Iweala during her first day in the office, and you are here to provide her with advice about how to approach, what's the roadmap? What are you going to say? Mr. Hormats, would you like to go first?
Well, I'll start out by saying that the dispute settlement process needs to be made considerably more efficient than it has been. Even though I will say the U.S. has by and large won a lot of its cases, the process has created a lot of uncertainties and often moves more slowly than it should. The second is for the WTO to be able to identify new areas where trade disputes are emerging that were not originally envisaged when the WTO was created. And that may involve more controversy among countries. Different countries may have different views on issues like intellectual property, on certain kinds of services.
In that regard, how many of them are the things that you should you could meaning the United States, work out with its allies? And how many of them will be also need to be worked out between China and the US bilaterally, and also in a multilateral platform as well? Mr. Hormats, what's your take?
Well, I think in this administration, the objective of at least Secretary Blinken and the president is to have conversations with our allies. Don't forget, we've had disputes with them too. It's not as if our only disputes have been with China. We need to work out certain things with our friends and allies, because we generally see trade in a similar prism or through a similar prism. I don't think issues will be worked out bilaterally with China alone. I think it'll be a combination of working with friends and allies who share certain more market-oriented views, and then having a conversation with China. China has to be part of it. But also one other point, we pulled out of the TPP.
Yeah.
The United States is not likely to go back to the TPP, but it certainly can consult the TPP, the new TPP,
CPTPP,
on some of these rule-changing issues.
Let's go to the Chinese side. Professor Liu Baocheng, tell me more about the intellectual property and some of the other issues that could be of great debate in the WTO. Also have been mentioned, for example, in the first foreign policy speech by President Biden, and later also in the phone call between the Secretary of State Blinken with China's top diplomat, Director Yang Jiechi. How will China and U.S., being the largest developed country and the largest developing country be able to work it out bilaterally? Will that have an impact directly to the multilateral approach that's likely to taking place at WTO?
Well, definitely, because they are the giant in the zoo. So therefore, by building consensus, because that's the essence of WTO among those big trading partners, means quite a lot for the global trading platform over there. But the issue is that do we have, the common agenda? For example, the U.S. is understood as really trying to take the WTO reform to work against, quote unquote, China taking advantage of those loopholes. For example, in terms of the state-owned enterprises and government subsidies, etc. And whereas China is proposing more inclusive development and this, defending the consensus building process. So these are really the remaining differences that can be taking a very long time to iron out.
Mr. Woodka, I know that there are issues of the European Unions that are very much in line with your ally, the United States. However, there are other issues that Europeans have been working quite closely with China, for example, on trade. So how will the European decision maker articulate, particularly in the area of trade, articulate all this process likely to come further down the road?
Tianwei, recently I, as president of the chamber, have launched a paper which is already indicating the problem is decoupling. You can see the rift between China and the US and how Europe is stressed out with the US as well as with China. And basically the decoupling report is geared towards the European authorities and Chinese, basically in the area of technology. We think that we are running a risk of having a fight on the industry of the future. It's software, it's semiconductors. And there we have to find a common ground, I guess, between all three major players. Now, it's certainly easier in order to find a common ground with someone like the Biden administration, as we shared a lot of things in common in the past. But at the same time, China is just a huge body that should not be neglected and has to be an important player of that. We have to align in the allies, but at the same time have to have a good agreement to talk to China. I mean, recently we signed this comprehensive agreement of investment between Europe and China that shows that actually things can be discussed, can be done, even though it's a baby step.
Professor Xiao, China has been doing its work with the United States, for example, with this new administration, not long after it's coming into the office, some kinds of discussions. And also, certainly over the past years, China has been talking with the European Union about some of the crucial issues. So what kind of, if you are sitting there giving Ms. Okonjo-Iweala some advice about what to do as the head of WTO to approach to the next stage, what would you say?
Well, first of all, I think WTO has to recognize that now there are other mechanisms, like RCEP and the China-Europe agreement, and even including a lot of bilateral, which are all basically pressure on the WTO to do something.
And also CP,
and then
TPP,
I think right. And also, I think WTO need to recognize that it is really crucial for WTO to create what I call the global dividend of multilateral platform, because only through this way, China, United States, Europe, everyone can benefit. We are already a global village. Without cooperation, everybody loses, and we have been losing for so many years, we can't wait. So I think that kind of urgency is crucial to get rid of a lot of politics and really do something. And that would be some, landmark, anyone on that position could make.
That's exactly what I want to ask Mr. Hormats. Will WTO become a battleground between China and the United States, or between China and some other developing countries vis-a-vis the United States and what the U.S. call its allies. Will that be one of those scenarios? And how will the U.S. trying to avoid that scenario?
Well, it's a very good question. I mean, if decoupling does proceed, and there are those in the U.S. who have supported it as well. I don't, but there are those who do. Then the WTO could be a battleground with the U.S. Trying to get countries to support it against China, and China trying to get countries to support it against the U.S. I think if it becomes a battleground, it's doomed to failure. It's not that we agree on everything. I don't think we're going to agree on everything. We're going to be competing on certain things. But it needs a framework, a credible framework for resolving differences. And it needs a set of rules, not that solve everything, but that do deal with these new issues like technology and services and intellectual property, at least some framework of rules. If it doesn't have a framework of rules and it doesn't have an orderly process for resolving disputes, it will become even more ineffective than it has been in the past. So those are things that are important. So China and the U.S. have to have a measure, perhaps not full cooperation on everything, but a measure of cooperation, because if the WTO fails and it's sort of every country for itself, that hurts China and the U.S. because we're both big trading countries. So we need a framework of rules and a dispute settlement for our own interests. They may be different in some ways, but we need that framework and that credibility.
That would take enormous courage and political wisdom, and I guess a lot of agenda setting at home for both countries, isn't it, Mr. Hormats?
Oh, yes. We're going to have to work the administration. We have a new trade negotiator, as you know, who actually is fluent in Mandarin. So she will be an interesting negotiator with China. But we need in the U.S. to figure out what our agenda is, what are our major objectives, what are the middle level, and what are the lesser objectives of lesser importance, and also figure out a process for pulling countries together.
What do you think U.S. should want? You've been working as the Undersecretary of State for international business and also a lot of international relations related to business environment. Tell me more about your thoughts.
My thought is that what we need, it's a colloquialism, but I'll say it anyway, and that is we need level playing field. We need to have a set of rules that everyone plays by. If we have different sets of rules and one country plays by its set of rules and another plays by another, then we will not have a system. It has to be a fair system. And the problem is that in the U.S., there's not much support, and it's not a priority. Trade at this point is not a major priority. For some sectors, like farm sector, it is. But we need to figure out ways in which we can demonstrate to the American people that the system is fair. If we do that, then I think we'll get more support, not just for the WTO, but for trade.
Mr. Woodka, from your point, will the WTO become a battleground of geopolitics? Well, it has always been related to geopolitics, let's not deny that, but will it become an ultimate battleground of geopolitics, particularly between China and the United States? And the Europeans' role is kind of interesting, tricky, but at the same time could always take advantage of here and there from time to time.
Well, there's a clear danger. It becomes a battleground, but I guess the Europeans are very keen that these two extremes that developed over the last 2 decades are being tackled. I mean, WTO was founded in the times of raw capitalism, and as it turned out to be, was the sort of initiator, not WTO itself, but I mean the raw capitalism was of course causing this kind of lack of progress for workers, for middle class, in particular the US, that then led to the success of Trump. So there has to be something that claws back power of this kind of freewheeling of the financial markets and so forth. And now we have entered a new phase, particularly over the last 10 years with the ascent of China, the kind of state-sponsored system with state-owned enterprises, subsidies, the threat of technology transfers and so forth. That has to be tackled too. So I guess we have to find a platform where we can actually discuss how to come back with a fair trading system that takes care of the middle class and the other people in Europe, as well as looking into the benefits for the developing world. I mean, we talk about COVID-19, the vaccine is being rolled out, and it has to be basically produced as much as possible, but intellectual property rights is in the way of it, and that is very tricky. But I guess that Dr. Okonjo is best placed, as she's the head of the UN-sponsored Gavi system, but that has to be really resolved in order to get the buy-in from the developing country. How do we produce and disseminate medicine with a benefit for pharmaceuticals and IPR protection, as well as speed and access to this medicine?
Well, that would be one issue related to IPR, because if you want to have more manufacturing doing the vaccines, you're going to share the IPR in an emergency situation. We're going to see how that plays out. There are issues between China and the United States, particularly during the past 3 years of trade war. It is about technology transfer. It is about global supply chains that many know it is violating the already existing rule of the World Trade Organization. So how will China and the US be able to work that out bilaterally so that to show a good example to the rest of the world on the platform of WTO that things can be resolved?
After almost 6 years fight, there has to be a consensus that the trade war will hurt everybody, and not only between China and the United States, but also the rest of the world. So therefore, to defend the global trading system, to go for fair dispute resolution, and that's the right path to go, instead of unilaterally imposing protectionism and penalty on each other. So, and right now, it is really the time with the new administration in the United States that to restore and repair the impaired WTO trading system, particularly the appellate board, and that can really help to solve certain issues. And the other is that whether we are going to have a phase 2 talk between China and the United States, so that remains to be seen. However, the trade relations will have to move forward in different type of format. So much is really dependent on how the new Biden administration make the right type of approach and proposal to China.
All right. Mr. Hormat, please respond briefly.
Let me just take up the point about the U.S. and China and how we work together. I would not be in favor of a big, grand round 2. First of all, round 1 is not fully implemented, and there are a lot of wrinkles and twists and turns to make sure it's implemented. But second, one grand round 2 would be taking on too many issues. So what I think is important is for middle-level people, but in Beijing and Washington, to figure out 2 or 3 centrally important issues that they work together on. This is not to say excluding our friends and allies, but that they work together on bilaterally to try to work out differences, and where they might be able to agree on changes in the WTO. But I wouldn't have a grand round. I'd have serious people who are technical experts start work together without the publicity of a big trade round, but figuring out where the system has areas of major disagreement and how to narrow those down. And I think that would be a starting point.
I remember Secretary Schultz used to say, the diplomat's work is to tend the garden of diplomacy. I guess that to a degree, that's what you're trying to say, to let the middle level bureaucrats work something out.
And then get things ready.
Right.
And then the senior people can do this. But The last time around, there was a lot of publicity. We're almost in agreement. We're close, but we're not. And disappointments just make people skeptical about the process. Let's do it in a serious way so that when we agree and we say we agree, we actually do agree. We don't pull back from the agreements that we've made. That just undermines confidence, which
Be professional.
happened last time.
Be professional. That's very important. Now, last round, very briefly from every one of you, one sentence. What can we rely on now to make WTO work? Let's start from Professor Liu.
WTO is formed based on the consensus, so therefore consensus is still required, but how to move is the right type of efficiency and inclusiveness design, and that requires a new wisdom and new courage of those politicians and experts involved.
Mr. Woodka.
Well, we have a good leadership. We have to get the appellate body back again. We have to work on the infrastructure. And then just realize there's nothing else that substitutes the WTO. So necessity, COVID-19, if we don't start working now, we're going to be in shambles in a couple of years.
Professor Xiaogeng.
Well, I think members of WTO should recognize, cooperation and competition can coexist.
Very interesting. Last but not least, Mr. Hormat.
I would agree. Cooperation and competition can coexist. I think it's important to pick 2 or 3 issues where we show that the WTO can make progress. For infrastructure and the appellate body is important, but substantive issues where WTO can actually make progress, that would enhance its credibility and that would be good for the World Trade.
I think the most important thing, we need to have confidence about the World Trade Organization, and it has to show with great examples. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for your rich input. Jörg Woodka, Liu Baocheng, Xiaogeng, and Robert Hormat. Really appreciate it. Thank you.